But anyway, so we're jumping into Romans tonight, and we'll see how far we get. I think we'll probably get all the way through Romans tonight. So we have a number of letters. So we're entering into the letters in the early church. And so a little bit about Romans. So the letters, as we've learned with a lot of the books in the Bible, they are not in chronological order. And the letters are not either. The letter of Paul to the Romans is first because it's the longest letter. And so that's why it's first, but probably it was written later in Paul's career. And this letter is being written to people that Paul probably never met. And so it's an interesting letter from that perspective. And we're going to start with an overview from the Bible Project. The Bible Project videos tonight are broken up into Romans 1 through 4 as the first half, and then the rest of Romans is the second half. So we have 2 videos, and so we'll take a pause in between. But before we jump into that, what were your first thoughts about Romans, things that you noticed or that popped out at you as you were reading?
Oh gosh. If I could read my writing, I'd share.
Or any opinions on Paul?
Well, for the first half of Romans, I think he really stressed that faith in God through Jesus Christ is the sole condition for salvation. And he goes into a number of examples that the gospel is for everybody, that people got into trouble because they worshiped and served creatures instead of the creator. And for some reason, I must have read that hundreds of times, but it really grabbed my attention when I was reading it for this class.
Camille, I agree. It's that righteousness through faith.
Yep.
And the whole thing about circumcision too, that plays a huge part in this.
Oh yeah. Indicating that, in fact, I think part of it is he said the Jews would have to essentially learn from the Gentiles, become more worshipful Jews in Christ. He's talking about everybody. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. They are justified by grace as a gift through Jesus Christ. And that the law for the Jews made them aware of sin, but in following just man's laws, they were missing the point of being given the grace of forgiveness by God through Jesus. That was the first 4 chapters for me.
There are also an awful lot of phrases or sentences that I've heard in sermons for years. It seems like a lot of sermons may come from Romans, what he's saying.
Mary pointed that out too, that there's so many familiar voices. Romans must appear in lots in the lectionary, also stressed in my Lutheran upbringing and confirmation.
Yeah.
Are you talking about an acrostic poem, Mary, where each? No, I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, was this in like your confirmation? Okay.
Put it back up, Mary, put it back up. I didn't see it.
So she says it's the alphabet of Bible verses. So letter A, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Letter B, be thou faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. Do you have these all memorized? Does it go all the way through to Z? You don't have them all memorized. Okay. You have the first 2. That's pretty good.
Yeah. There were a lot of verses later in the chapter that I must have sat and read by patients' bedside as a hospice chaplain tons of times. Nothing separates us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. Gave no one anything but love. He who
And no
loves
one can separate us from the love of God.
There's, thank you. Nothing can separate us from the love of God.
Yeah.
Yeah, all of that stuff. So there were a lot that were taken from this letter to give hope, give some solace to people who were in end-stage illness.
I also like the part he talks about there's no distinction between the Greek and the Jew.
Right, right.
For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. So this.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's a lot of places in Romans that are used and used and brought forward in different places.
Yeah.
And my dog has something to say about Romans too.
Well, this is the big one where they say, love your neighbor as yourself.
Mhm.
You know, I don't know that I knew that's where this came from, but
Well, in let's see, yeah. In chapter 8, verse 9, the Spirit of God dwells in you. And I don't think people really grabbed onto that easily, really easily. When you're continually looking outward and wanting the a beneficent God to smile upon you, is always out there. I think this is a pretty revolutionary thought, that the Spirit dwells within.
I also like chapter 14:7.
Mhm.
You know, it says the end of it is, so then whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's.
Mhm.
That's a very comforting.
Mhm. Yeah.
And also the one about let us therefore no longer pass judgment,
Mhm.
but resolve instead to never put a stumbling block or a hindrance in the way of another. There's a lot of stuff in here that's good.
There's a lot in Romans. So just so much. Some of the things Paul's trying to do in Romans is, first of all, he's trying to appeal to these people that he's never met before. And there's a bit of an ask that's happening too, because he's trying to get funds to help him get to Spain. And so he's trying to grow his backing in order to spread the gospel news either further. He's also trying to address misunderstandings about Paul's gospel and what he's been teaching. And so he's really trying to clarify things, or things that he's heard that maybe they've been saying, to try to bring more clarity to it, instead of just secondhand or third hand as what they're believing. And he's also trying to address this Jewish and Gentile strife in the church that's occurring as well. And we've been hearing this throughout. We heard it some in Acts too, and we'll hear it some more in the letters. And there's this, if you look at Romans chapter 1, verses 17 through 18, this is like a short thesis of Paul's letter. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek or Gentile. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. And so that's one of the main things Paul's trying to get out to the people, and then he expands on that. So that's kind of his. So if you're underlining, Toby, you had mentioned that you have a lot of underlining, like this would be a place to start. this chapter 1, verses 6 through 17 as a thesis of Romans.
Yeah, I have it. The other one is at the end when he cautions people. You know, I urge you, brothers and sisters, to keep an eye on those who cause dissension and offenses in opposition to the teaching that you have learned, and avoid them. So that, you know, to just say, beware of those people who will try to.
Yep.
Mary wrote a comment following up on Camille's comment about the Spirit dwelling within. Wouldn't that be a departure from the Jewish idea that God dwelt in the temple in Jerusalem? Or had the Jews moved from that idea by the time Romans was written?
I don't think so.
Well, there's there's a significant movement that happens. Remember when they're taken in exile, but by the Babylonians. And so before the Babylonian exile, it was really like God was moved with the Ark of the Covenant. God was moved as part of the temple. But then they had the temple of Jerusalem was destroyed and they were in exile. And that period was when there was a transformation that started to happen as far as where is God actually located. And then we can see in some of the texts in that time, even in the Old Testament already, that God, it wasn't that God abandoned the people, but God also went into exile with the people in Babylon. And so that God, where God was even broader. Yeah. So this idea that God or the Spirit would only be in a particular location was not completely new with Christianity or new with the early church. So, but it's being developed farther. They're definitely pulling that stream farther. And the second temple then was destroyed too. And so they had to go further, that God dwells beyond that. But they're also trying to stay away from that, like the body doesn't matter, because there's some movements around that too, that really it's just spirit. Like Jesus, one of the heretical things was that Jesus wasn't really human or a body. Jesus was just a spirit that appeared to be a body, and that was thrown out as being a heretical statement. But there were movements around that people were believing. And so that's
I didn't know that.
Why it's important, where when they talk about the Spirit, there's conversations in the early church about what's happening with the Spirit in this place. Like what's spiritual, what's body, how is the body and spirit connected with one another? How is it not connected?
Yeah, in chapter 8, I think this is what you're talking about, chapter 8, verses 9 and 10. But you are not in the flesh, you are in the Spirit. If in fact the Spirit of God dwells in you, anyone who does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him. But if Christ is in you, although your bodies are dead because of sin, your spirits are alive because of righteousness. And I think he reiterates that several times through this letter.
Go on with that. Do the next couple of sentences, Camille.
Okay. If the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also through his Spirit, which dwells in you.
I think that's really
chapter
comforting.
8.
Yeah.
Yep. Chapter 8, that was verse 11.
And notice it's not just you have life in your spirit, but that there's life in your body as well.
Yes.
And
yes.
that's an important piece. That's a discussion point too.
Yeah. And one that if you're talking about comfort, this is one that I have read many times. And all these things, this is chapter 8, verse 27. And all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death nor life, I always thought that was very important, neither death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depths, not anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. That has often given a great deal of comfort, especially to people who have been told they weren't very nice and they were going to burn in hell forever.
Yeah.
Um,
Also in
That's
chapter
good.
8, there's a piece that's sometimes lost in translation. So if you have the NRSV, chapter 8, verse 14 reads, "For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God," and which makes it so that it's more inclusive of all genders. But that word children of God, it's specifically trying to say, though children who inherit. So if you were to read it in Greek, it would say sons, because they were the ones who would inherit. And so the important point of it is not just that they're children, but that they're children who will be inherent, who are part of the inheritance, is a piece of that. So it's even stronger than your children, but you are children that are to receive all that it already is available, in that everything is coming to you.
Can you go on in that, go down to chapter or to verse 29?
And
I didn't understand some of this. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed in the image of his son, in order that he might be the firstborn within a large family. I didn't know. What's the large family? Is that all of earth? Or I didn't understand that.
I think within, like, the firstborn typically would inherit more, but within a large family, in Greek, it also is among many brothers. I don't know what the inheritance laws were in that time. That I would say that's what they're talking about here. What are the inheritance laws in Rome at this time?
I've got a footnote. Well, I'm reading, I think, from the Bible that you're familiar with, the New Expert Annotated, and my footnote for 29 is to be conformed to his son is to share the resurrection life of Christ, to be a fellow heir.
That makes
Be
more sense.
glorified.
That makes more sense.
Okay.
I just didn't understand the thing. And those whom he predestined, you know, who did he also called? And those whom he called, he also justified. And those, and I don't know, is that all of us? That's what I don't understand.
So this is bringing it further that Gentiles are also being included. And so that's one of the points that is.
Okay, that's what I wondered. It's all of, it's all, okay.
Yeah. But there are arguments about what does it mean to be predestined. There's some Christians who believe in predestination, and there's others who do not. In that, and there's different types of predestination within that as well. We probably do a whole class just on predestination. But basically, before you're even born, is it decided, would you be following Christ and would you be saved or not? Which then relies on your understanding of what salvation is and what that means, and your understanding of heaven and hell and afterlife and all of that too.
Oh. In chapter 10, we also learn that Gretchen has beautiful feet. How beautiful are the feet of those who preach good news.
Where is that?
It is in chapter 10. Let's see. in verse 15, chapter 10, verse 15.
Oh, yeah.
As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach good news.
Definitely referring to those who would be traveling preachers.
Yeah.
For their feet, no matter what they look like, are beautiful when it brings good news. So that's funny though. There are a number of verses that when you just read them are kind of funny. Just there's one in like First Kings 20 where like these prophets just start slapping each other. Like, like it's just the prophet slapping. And there's another one, Leviticus 6, where it talks about like it commands priests to wear their underwear. Like,
I gotta look for those gems.
Yeah, there. I mean, in John 2 or John 21, Peter he's like naked in the boat, and then he's gonna go follow Christ. So he puts his clothes on, and then he jumps in the water.
Yeah.
Like, why'd you put your clothes on, Peter, to jump in the water? Some interesting things like that.
It's also kind of nice the way he talks about the Gentiles, you know, that they'll stumble and fall and make all kinds of mistakes, and that's okay. And, you know, if their rejection is reconciliation of the world, you know, will their acceptance be but life from death? It's just very, very comforting.
Yeah.
Yes, I quite agree. This was a good read.
Good. Yeah, and it's written in a way that it is easier to read. So all the letters, as in chapter 1, we start with a greeting in all of the letters. And there's this formula that's happening within the letters. So it begins with the name of the sender and the name of the recipient, and then also a short greeting in that before it goes into the message itself. So we can get an idea of maybe who Paul is writing to, or at least who in Paul's name it is being written to.
The other thing that makes me feel good about it is he really talks about how love is so important. You know, this is where you get to love one another and all of these, you know, and let us no longer pass judgment on each other. Don't put a stumbling block or hindrance. I mean, it's just it's a way to live.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, should we see some of the structure insight from Bible Project? So I'm going to share my screen here. And we will watch this. There we go.
Paul's letter to the Romans. It's one of the longest and most significant things ever written by the man who was formerly known as Saul of Tarsus. He was a Jewish rabbi belonging to a group known as the Pharisees, and he was passionate and devout to the Torah of Moses and the traditions of Israel. And he saw Jesus and his followers as a threat. But then he had a radical encounter with the risen Jesus, who commissioned him as an apostle, like an official representative, to the world of non-Jewish people called Gentiles in the Bible. And so he started going by his Roman name, Paul, and he traveled all around the ancient Roman Empire, telling people about the risen King Jesus, and forming his followers then into these new communities called churches. And Paul would occasionally write letters to these new Jesus communities to help them foster their faith or answer questions, and the book of Romans is one of these. It was actually written quite late in his career. Now, we know from the book of Acts that the church in Rome had existed for some time, that it was made up of Jewish and non-Jewish followers of Jesus. But at one point, the Roman Emperor Claudius had expelled all of the Jewish people from Rome. And then about 5 years later, all of those Jews, including Jesus-following Jews, were allowed to return. And when they did, they found a church that had become very non-Jewish in custom and practice. And so this created lots of tension, so that by Paul's day, the Roman church was divided. People disagreed about how to follow Jesus. They were debating about whether non-Jewish Christians should celebrate the Sabbath or eat kosher or be circumcised. And so Paul wrote this letter to accomplish a few things. He wanted this divided church to become unified, and for a practical purpose. He was hoping that the Roman church could become a staging ground for his mission to go even further west, all the way to Spain. And so these circumstances are what motivated Paul to write out his fullest explanation of the gospel, the good news that he was announcing about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Now, the letter is designed to have 4 main movements, but it's unified as one long flowing exploration of the gospel. The gospel, Paul says, first of all, reveals God's righteousness, and then it also creates a new humanity, which fulfills God's promise to Israel. And so it's this gospel that's going to unify the church. In this video, we're just going to explore the ideas in chapters 1 through 4. So Paul opens by introducing himself as an apostle appointed by God to spread the gospel about Jesus, how he's the Messiah of Israel who was raised from the dead as the Son of God, King of the nations. And Jesus now calls all humanity to come under his loving rule. And Paul says this good news about King Jesus is, first of all, God's power to save people who trust in him, and second, that it reveals God's righteousness. Now, righteousness is a rich Old Testament word for Paul. It describes God's character, that he always does justice, what is right and what is good, but also that he is faithful and just to fulfill his promises. And Paul's saying that the story of Jesus shows how God has done both of these things. How? Well, he goes first into a long creative retelling of Genesis chapters 3 through 11. He shows how all the Gentile world, all the nations, have become trapped in the spiral of sin and selfishness. The human heart and mind are broken, Paul says. We've turned away from God to embrace idolatry, which means finding ultimate significance in created things and then giving ultimate allegiance to these things that are not God. This results in a distortion of our humanity and destructive behavior. And so what's left is a humanity that stands guilty as charged before a just and righteous God. To which the people of Israel might say, well, it's a good thing then that God chose our people out from among the nations. He saved us out of slavery in Egypt. He gave us the laws of the Torah, like the Sabbath and eating kosher and circumcision. And these all together show us how to live as God's holy people. But, Paul says, not so fast. He recalls the storyline of the Torah and of the rest of the Old Testament, which shows that Israel was just as sinful and idolatrous and morally broken as the rest of humanity. Israel is actually more guilty than the Gentiles, Paul says, because they have the Torah. They should know better. And so, Paul concludes, all humanity, Gentiles, Israelites, are hopelessly trapped and guilty before God. But that is not the final word. The good news about Jesus is God's response. Instead of holding humanity guilty, Jesus came as Israel's Messiah to die on behalf of all people as a sacrifice for sins. As our representative, Jesus took into himself all of the just consequences of the pain, the sin, and the death that we have caused in the world. And he overcame it all by his resurrection from the dead. It's his new resurrection life that he makes available to others. Jesus became what we are so that we might become what he is. And all of this, Paul says, is how God justifies those who trust or have faith in Jesus. Now, justification is another rich Old Testament term for Paul, and it's related to God's righteousness. It literally means to declare righteous. Because of what Jesus did on our behalf, we are given a new status before God. Instead of finding us guilty, God declares that a person is in a right relationship with him and is forgiven. Justification results in a new family. The person who trusts in Jesus is given a place among God's covenant people. Justification also results in a new future, which begins a journey of life transformation by God's grace. And so all of these things about justification are God's gift to those who through their faith are in Christ. And so this leads Paul in chapter 4 to explore the huge implications that all of this has for who can be a part of God's covenant family. He goes back to the story of Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. Before any of the laws of the Torah were given to Israel, Abraham was justified or declared righteous before God. How? Well, God promised that Abraham would become a father of a large multi-ethnic family that would receive God's blessing. But he and his wife Sarah, they were really old. They had never been able to have children. But nonetheless, Abraham had radical faith and trust in God's promise, and so God declared him to be righteous. And so Paul says, now Abraham has become the father of God's new covenant family, and it's spreading all around the world. It's made up of Jews and Gentiles who have the same kind of faith and trust in the one who fulfilled God's promise to Abraham, Jesus the Messiah. So let's pause and summarize Paul's main ideas here in chapters 1 through 4, because they're the foundation for understanding the rest of the letter. All humanity is hopelessly trapped in sin and needs to be rescued. That rescue, however, is not going to happen by people trying to obey the laws of the Torah. Rather, God's righteous character has moved him to rescue the world through Jesus' death and resurrection, so that he could create that multi-ethnic family of Abraham based on faith as his own new covenant people. And so Paul's going to go on to show how this new family is a part of something much, much bigger that calls them to a whole new way of life together. But it's all going to be rooted in these core ideas explored in chapters 1 through 4 of Paul's letter to the Romans.
Mhm. I really like how those little blurbs really boil it down, easily understandable concepts, outlining it very well.
Yeah, and I have the book of what's in the video. So if you ever want to look at the pieces all drawn out, I know it's almost more helpful to see him talk about it while he's drawing it out. But if you ever want to look at that, I do have a book in my office that has all of them in there. It's
I'd be interested in looking at
a big book, so you can actually see it. It's not thick, it's just really big.
Mhm. Mhm. That would be neat. Okay.
Any thoughts from this first? Otherwise, we'll watch the second video and see
Yeah.
if it brings that forward now that we've heard 1 through 4.
That would be good.
All right, let's jump into the next one.
Paul's letter to the Romans. Check out the first video where we explored who Paul was, why he wrote this letter, and where we trace the core ideas of chapters 1 through 4. That all humanity is hopelessly trapped in sin and needs to be rescued. That this rescue is not going to happen by people trying to obey the laws of the Torah. Rather, God's righteous character has moved him to rescue the world through Jesus' death and resurrection so that he could create a faith-based multi-ethnic family of Abraham as his people. Now, in the remaining 3 movements of the letter to the Romans, Paul is going to develop these ideas even more. So remember, Paul's exploration of justification by faith, that when people trust Jesus' death and resurrection was for them, they're given a new status, they're right with God, they're placed in a new family, the covenant people of Abraham, and they're given a new future, the hope of a transformed life. Now Paul wants to show how this reality should reshape every part of our existence, because being in this family means being a part of a new humanity that God is creating through Jesus and the Spirit. So Paul goes back to the first human character of the biblical story, Adam. His name means humanity. And Adam, like all humanity after him, has chosen sin and selfishness. And so everyone faces God's judgment because we've become slaves to sin's influence, resulting in death. But then Paul contrasts Adam with Jesus, who he says is the new Adam, a human who lived in faithful obedience to God, shown through his act of sacrificial love. And now Jesus offers his life as a gift to others so that they can be justified before God. And so Jesus stands as the head of a new humanity that is being transformed by this gift, which leads him to chapter 6. Paul reminds these Christians in Rome that choosing to follow Jesus means leaving their old Adam-like humanity and entering into the new Jesus-like humanity. And their baptism was a sacred symbol of that transition. Their old humanity died with Jesus, and their new humanity was raised with him from the dead. So when a person trusts in Jesus, their life becomes joined to his life. What's true of him is now true of them. It's when people accept their identity as Jesus-like humans that they are liberated to become the wholehearted humans who can truly love God and their neighbor. Now, if creating this new humanity was always God's purpose, Paul asks in chapter 7, what then was the point of God giving Israel the law, or in Hebrew, the Torah? Now, side note, when Paul uses this word law, he sometimes means the storyline and message of the first 5 books of the Bible, but other times he's more specifically referring to the hundreds of commands given through Moses and that are found in the Torah. The second meaning is Paul's focus here. What was the purpose of all those commands? Paul says that the commands of the Torah were good. They showed God's will for how Israel was to live. But if you read the storyline of the Torah, Israel broke all those commands. The more laws Israel received, the more they replayed the sin of Adam and rebelled. So even when God gave his people specific moral rules to obey, that did not fix the problem of the sinful human heart. And so paradoxically, these rules made Israel even more guilty. But, Paul says, that paradox is the point. God's goal was to make it crystal clear that it's evil that's hijacked the human heart, and that the Torah, good as it is, could not do a thing about it. But, Paul says in chapter 8, the solution has arrived in Jesus and the Spirit. And here's how. The commands of the Torah acted like a magnifying glass. It focused the problem of the human condition into one place, the people of Israel. But now Israel's representative, Jesus the Messiah, has paid for and dealt with all of that sin through his death and his resurrection. And now Jesus has released his Spirit into his new family to transform their hearts so that they can truly fulfill the call of all the Torah's commands to love God and neighbor. And there's more. God's renewal of human beings is the first step of his larger mission to rescue and renew all of creation, making it a place where his love gets the final word. Now you can see how chapters 1 through 8 are one long flow of thought here, but it raises some other questions. If all of this was God's purpose, what is the current status then of Paul's fellow Israelites who don't acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah? How does this story fulfill God's promises to them? Well, Paul begins in chapter 9 with his own anguish over fellow Israelites who don't think Jesus is their Messiah. And it leads him to reflect on Israel in the past from the Old Testament story. And he reminds us that simply being an ethnic Israelite, a physical descendant of Abraham, never made one automatically a faithful member of the covenant family. Paul shows us how God has always selected a subset from Abraham's family to carry on the line of promise. And his point is that now that line of promise is carried on by those who follow Jesus. He reminds us that for a long time, people inside and outside Abraham's family have rejected God's will. He reminds us of the story of Israel and the golden calf and of Pharaoh's rebellion. He shows us how God was able to orchestrate events so that people's rejection of him actually accomplished his redemptive purposes. And so in chapter 10, Paul turns his focus to Israel in the present. The reason many Israelites reject Jesus is because they're basing their covenant relationship with God on their performance of the commands in the Torah. And so sadly, they don't recognize what God has done through Jesus to create a new covenant family on the basis of faith. And so Paul asks in chapter 11, what is Israel's future? Has God written off his people? No, he says. There are tons of Jewish people, including himself, who do recognize Jesus as their Messiah, but there are also a lot who don't. But God has been able to use their rejection for his own purposes. It's caused the gospel to spread even quicker and farther into the Gentile world, making the family of Abraham even larger and more multi-ethnic. Paul describes God's covenant family as a big olive tree, and the rejectors of Jesus have been broken off, so to speak, and these Gentiles are like wild branches that have been grafted into the family tree. However, Paul says, one day Jesus will be acknowledged by his own people. He doesn't offer any details about how. Paul simply trusts God's character and promise that he won't give up on his covenant people. which transitions into the final section of the book, chapters 12 through 16. But remember the big picture. Because of their faith in Jesus, Jews and Gentiles are now together Abraham's family, that new humanity that's being transformed by God's Spirit. And so, this is how God's fulfilling his ancient promises. Therefore, the only reasonable response is for these Jews and non-Jewish Christians to be unified as the church. In chapters 12 to 13, he shows that this unity will come from a commitment to love and forgive each other. Love will look like everybody using their diverse gifts and talents to serve one another in the church. And it will also mean humility and forgiveness. When these different ethnic groups and cultures come together in Jesus, conflict is inevitable, and it can only be overcome through the hard work of forgiveness and reconciliation. This is how they will show the greatest of Christian virtues, love, which fulfills the Torah's greatest commands to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. In chapters 14 and 15, he focuses specifically on the issues that are creating ethnic divisions in the Roman church. These are disputes about the Jewish food laws and the Sabbath. And Paul says these practices don't define who's in or out of Jesus' family. And if people differ over these culturally important but non-essential issues, they need to learn how to respect each other's differences. And it's in this way that love will heal and unify Jesus' family. Paul closes the letter by first commending Phoebe, who's a key leader in the church of Cenchreae. She had the honor of carrying and perhaps even reading this letter aloud to the Roman churches for the first time. Paul then concludes by greeting all the people that he hasn't seen for a long time, and that's the end. Whoa. You can see better now how all the pieces of this letter fit together and show what a profound masterpiece it truly is. That's what the letter to the Romans is all about.
Nice snapshot.
There we have it. The letter to the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
Some things about just the Roman times that are a little different than ours is so a sense of privacy is not the same in Roman times as it is now. And so things would be more shared or known about each other maybe in Roman times than they would have been now. And so alongside of that is more important than guilt. Like when we hear Paul talk about sin, in Roman times, shame is what's spoken of more than guilt. And when we hear it, we think more of guilt. But there's a difference between, there's no record of guilt in this time, but there would be a record of shame that would follow you throughout. And so that's something that maybe Paul would have said the way he said some things differently if he was speaking to us today than when he was speaking to the Romans because of that. So the other thing is that morality and religion are separate things in Roman times. And so what you believe doesn't mean necessarily that you would be a good person or that you would act in a certain way. That these things are in Roman culture already separate. And so when Paul is talking about like deeds of faith and things, that's in their minds, like what you believe has nothing to do with how you would act necessarily. And he's starting to bring that together a little bit, that the way you treat one another in love is a part of your faith too. But still walking that line with that it's not acts of service that determine where you are. And so that's a piece that maybe would have been said differently than if Paul were writing a letter to us versus writing a letter to the Romans. which is helpful as we read through these early church letters. Just the name of the book tells us who the letter is being written to. And it helps remind us as well that although these letters are also written to us as the church, they were written in a specific context and within a specific cultural understanding of what's happening. And so it's good to even read them twice, once with that in mind, as far as, okay, what was Paul saying to people way back when the culture was different? And read again, okay, what's Paul saying to me now too? And holding both of those in tension.
As we go through these, can you give us like a picture of where they are and then who they were?
As far as so the cult, kind of who the people are.
Yeah, because to me, they're just different groups of people. I don't know the differences.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, we've got in Romans probably is what we know the most about, just because we know more about Rome than some of the other groups.
I know where Rome is.
Yeah.
I don't know where some of these places are. I've heard of them, but I don't know where they are.
Right.
Thessalonians.
Yeah. So Roman times, religion and gods were a part of everyday life. You would have had average life expectancy in Roman times, men probably around age 40 and women around age 25 or 30 would be.
But you got to remember that is an average, and that most people died when they were young. There were so many more deaths before the age of 5.
Well, so I maybe average wasn't the right word. That's your life expectancy in that time. So some people would live longer than that, but
I'm saying that I don't think it was, because the average, because when you had so many people dying at birth or in the first 2 years of life, the average goes down.
Yeah, it depends. The other thing we have to remember about the Roman world was that a majority of the population is malnourished and their injuries are untreated.
Right.
And so when we think of Rome in the stories we have, mostly we know about city people. We know about cities. We know about more of like what would be nobility type, people who were well off, people who had enough food to eat. And those were the ones that people who were literate, who were writing the stories, that's what we hear about. But we don't know much about the everyday life outside of city in Roman times. But we do know that there was a high percentage of malnutrition and in a lack of medical care, which is another thing that would lower life expectancy for the average person, not for, it depending on your social class as far as how long you might live. Which is also important as Paul's speaking in Romans, and he says, it doesn't matter if you're slave or free, like where you are doesn't matter, that these message isn't just for people who are going to live a longer life expectancy. It's not just for people who have enough food to eat. It's not just for people who have access to medical care, but that this is for people who won't live a very long life. This is for people who don't have enough to eat. And that's part of the importance in Acts. We hear about this sharing too. The poverty that some people are experiencing is extreme poverty. And so it's not just, I don't have my favorite food on the table. It's, I don't have any food on the table. Some of the poverty that we're experiencing. And then it's pretty incredible then to have this church be mixed with that. So you have, Paul's talking about the early church, this division between Gentiles and Jews, as the video explained, coming back and realizing, the church changed a little bit. How do we fit back together again? And Paul encouraging that. But also just the diversity within the church itself, as far as the economic diversity, which we struggle with today in the church. Most churches are divided racially, or they're divided economically. And they don't, many of our churches aren't multi-ethnic or contain all the diversity that exists in the wider community.
Mhm. Yeah.
The other thing about Romans is, so there was the way that the Bible Project presented it. Another way that some other scholars read it is that Paul is writing to the early church, and either he's writing to present his theology to them, is one way, or another way people read it is Paul is writing and he's addressing what problems he's hearing.
Mhm.
And so he's addressing the problem, offering a solution, problem, solution, problem, solution. And he's really trying to defend his perspective and his teachings, is another way that Romans is sometimes read as well. So not
Mhm.
just a sharing, but actually a defense that's being written. Another piece, so we have the two key kind of thesis ones, that chapter 1, 16 to 17. And another one to star in your Bibles would be chapter 3 in Romans, chapter 3, verses 21 through 31. This is another thesis paragraph of Paul in the book of Romans. And so if you were to want to just jump in and be reminded, okay, what's Romans about again? Those would be the two places to go in order to look at that.
Well, that's just for anybody, any Christian. That's kind of it, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's one of the most popular, is for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of
Right.
God. Mary,
Yep.
that was one that you had commented on in the Bible ABCs earlier. They're are justified. Justified means like being fixed, like they're being healed by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is Christ Jesus. And this is redemption would be like setting a person free, like their freedom was purchased, is what this word indicates to, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement. Atonement is that which removes sin and brings one in oneness with God. So by his blood, effective through faith, he did this to show his righteousness, because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over the sins previously committed. It was to prove at the present time that he himself is righteous, in that he justifies or fixes or rectifies the one who has faith in Jesus. So basically, God shows that God is righteous by always working for righteousness. And that's how you can recognize God at work in the world.
That's still the message of the church today.
Yeah. Well, any other thoughts on Romans? No, Eunice has jumped in here. There's one place in here that's interesting for Paul to have written, and that's chapter 13. And in this, Paul writes, Romans chapter 13, verse 1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities,
Yeah.
for there is no authority except from God. And those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Which is interesting. Paul is being like, he's receiving a lot of pressure from the authorities. He's going to be put on trial. Like, there's a lot of issues that Paul is having with the authorities. And in other places, Paul is not friendly to the politics with what he's writing. But here he's kind of like, it's okay, just be okay with the authorities. And so it's an interesting way that he is writing this. And maybe it's because he's writing to the Romans. He'd know your audience type thing of what to write. But it's just an interesting piece for him to have in this. Yeah, in Romans 13:1, as Mary said, has been used or misused by persons with agendas through the centuries to excuse political acts.
Yeah.
Well, we also have the thing that says, up at the top, pay your taxes,
Right.
So that there's a difference between God and Rome,
Yeah. Right. So there's definitely this, even early church, you can see there is tension with the politics. And how is the message transformed maybe by the political situation in some places?
Doesn't it also allow Paul, if you do have Rome listening and going around, and he says, look, you have to pay your taxes to Rome, this is the way it is, that also would appeal to the Romans. Otherwise, you might not have a church going on.
Right. Yeah. And then we have in chapter 15 around verse 22, that's when Paul is giving his ask for money to go to Spain. He says that this is the reason I have so often been hindered from coming to you. But now, with no further place for me in these regions, I desire, as I have for many years, to come to you when I go to Spain. For I do hope to see you on my journey and to be sent on by you once I've enjoyed your company for a little while. So this is his ask for support in order to continue his work.
Is Judea some special place, because he says there that I can rescue the unbelievers in Judea?
I think he's talking about the Jewish people who have rejected the Messiah.
And so he's going back to try to convince them?
Right.
Okay.
And Paul going back to Jerusalem is a dangerous place for him to go. And remember, we're locating this later in Paul's ministry. And
Okay.
When we talked in Acts last week, we talked about how Paul going back to Jerusalem meant that he got arrested and then got shoved around from court to court to court. And he was only shoved around from court to court to court because he was a Roman citizen. Otherwise, he might have just been killed.
Yeah.
And so he had some rights that many others did not have. So then we'll jump into next week, the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians. And First and Second Corinthians you'll probably recognize a lot of verses from there too, especially any like weddings or anything like that. But we read a lot.
Are we going to do both of them?
Let's do
one.
First Corinthians.
Yeah.
Okay.
They are addressing different issues within it. So we'll just each week we're going to go through a different letter. And so we'll do one letter a week.
Okay.
Well, thank you once again.
Yes, thank you very much, Gretchen.
Thank you for coming and sharing your thoughts too.
Appreciate your Well, I was so looking forward to this Bible study that I tried to get on an hour early and wondered where you were.
She called me and said, where is everyone?
Where is everybody?